Poštovani gledalci, dobar dan i dobrodošli u novi podcast salonskih razgovora. Moj današnji gost je Heinik. On je jedan od ljudi koji dobrovoljno sa svojom porodicom radi na Kosovu za neku manju naknadu. So I'll repeat the intro in English. Ovaj ćemo razgovor voditi na engleskom i prevešćemo ga subtitlom na srpski.
Yeah, problem, razumem.
So I'll make this intro in English as well. We have Heinik with us, who is with his family here working in Kosovo, trying to support us and support kids in Gračanici in learning English. He's engaged with local NGO called CCDMD, Center for Cultural Diversity and Minority Development.
Yes.
Yes, we made it.
It's a long name.
It's a long name, but as we said, it does its purpose.
Exactly.
Anyways, we found Matthew to be interesting. We found Matthew's work to be interesting. Matthew is teaching kids English, and he's living here in Gračanica. And what I know of him is that he's a history major, and that he's an interesting person that grew up in London. And we found a lot of the other night when we met and when we discussed, we find a lot of things interesting and in common growing up in different parts of the world, and now meeting here in this part of the world.
Yes.
Because I was in his part of the world at some point of my life, and now he's in my part of the world, and we have a lot of things in common, mainly from your part of the world. that are mainstream interesting things. I find it to be interesting to discuss a bit the way you grew up in London, and what were your idols, and what were your music preferences, and what was it like to be a teenager in Eastern London?
Yes.
Where you grew up?
Yes, it was good. Growing up was nice. I was very fortunate to have a good home, a good family. I felt very safe at home. Mum and dad, older brother, both sets of grandparents lived until they were old, so I had them around growing up, and they lived in the same town as us. So it was nice, and I felt safe. We were very lucky in the UK throughout the late 1980s and the 1990s, that politically very stable. We had the situation with Ireland, and we were aware that sometimes there could be problems in London.
But not to get into politics right away.
But in general, life was safe, yeah, and we had good access to lots of great music venues in London.
What was it like? Did you have like local bands around in your neighborhood, and what like?
Not too much. I think because we had London right on our doorstep, I could be in central London on a train in 30 minutes.
You could be anywhere in London in 30 minutes.
Exactly, yeah, exactly. So we're really lucky that we had so much access to global bands that would regularly come on tour to London. So I saw bands like U2, REM, I think was my very first concert. So we had lots of the big global bands would come to London, and so we were very lucky to be able to go and see them in big venues, maybe like Wembley Stadium. Bon Jovi was another band that I saw at Wembley Stadium, but then lots of smaller venues as well, where kind of up and coming British bands or up and coming American bands would be performing. And so it was always a good excuse to go up to London and see some music, and it generally felt very safe. It was good.
But in local pubs, like around in your neighborhood, what would be like the atmosphere over there?
Football was the big thing, more than music in our local pubs. So where I grew up, we were very close to West Ham United.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the big football club where my town is on the same train line as West Ham, and where a lot of people had moved out of East London kind of after the wars, they moved out to the edge of London where new neighbourhoods were being built. A lot of the football fans had travelled from there out to live at the edge of London, and that's what happened with my family. So my grandfather grew up right in the heart of West Ham, and then moved out to the edge of London. So he brought me up as a West Ham fan, but there's lots of Arsenal fans, lots of Tottenham fans, and as you find everywhere around the world, lots of Manchester United and Liverpool fans as well. So the pub culture where I grew up was more based around football, really. That was the big thing.
So that was your sport preference? Football?
Football very much first and foremost, but then I was interested in lots of other sports as well. So rugby union growing up was a big thing, and England won the World Cup for that when I was 19. In 2003 we won the World Cup, and we're still waiting to win the Football World Cup in my lifetime. Tennis was another big one, but we never had any good tennis players when I was a kid, so we've been lucky to have Andy Murray the last few years.
That's very interesting. That's actually for me very interesting. The country with Wimbledon.
With Wimbledon, yeah.
I mean, didn't generate a lot of good tennis players in the last decade, I would say. Maybe 2 decades. Other than Andy Murray.
And we had Andy Murray.
But even Andy Murray is retired now.
Tim Henman, who was...
Tim Henman, but he was okay, but he wasn't even,
But he was the first good tennis player we'd had for
a while.
Years.
Yeah, that's very interesting about the tennis nation, I would say.
And then Andy Murray emerged, but of course he was at the same time as Djokovic and Federer and Nadal. So he was almost as good as them, but not quite, and he kept losing in the finals to those guys. So tennis would be popular around the time of Wimbledon. Yeah, so the pub culture was very much football, or just getting together on a Friday evening with friends and having a few drinks to relax after the week.
Yeah, that was fun. We tried when I was a kid. We had a few enthusiasts. They were in Pristina, downtown. They had a spot where they played tennis. They had 2 rackets and 2 balls, and there was a wire, stretched from one end of the street to another, and they played tennis. And those were the only 2 chaps that I ever met, at the time, because tennis was not really popular. We did have, in Serbia, we had this Živojinović, who was a tennis player. I think he won one of the Grand Slams. Yeah. That was like the top he ever did.
Monica Seles.
We had Monica Seles up till some moment she escaped to USA.
Indeed, yes.
And then she got stabbed.
Yes.
Immediately after, I would say, by some crazy freak.
Yeah.
And we actually didn't have many of them. And then Djokovic came.
Yes.
And then tennis became widely popular. You can see old fat chaps like me, playing tennis. This is what we always did. We played tennis all our lives. Yeah. Although I knew only 2 guys, that really played tennis at the time.
Well, the silly thing for me was you were asking about my neighbourhood, and on my street, right directly opposite my house, was a 4 tennis courts, a little tennis club. But when I was a kid, they never had anything for kids. So I used to, every Saturday morning, get on my bike.
Watch the old guys.
Exactly. I used to get on my bike and ride across to the other side of town to play another tennis club all the way on the other side of town. And there was actually a club right on my doorstep, but never anything for kids. So yeah, I was very lucky that I was able to play a lot of sport growing up as well. So tennis was one sport I played a lot. Football I played every weekend for a little club. Played rugby at school. So you're very lucky to be able to play lots of sports as well as enjoying watching them as well.
See, what was interesting with my neighborhood is that is the neighborhood where a current prime minister grew up also.
Okay.
Wow. So we lived in the same neighborhood. So we had a basketball, improvised basketball court on the parking lot.
Okay.
And that's where the older people played, older generations played basketball.
Okay.
And we as the young ones, we could only sit and watch, and wait for our turn, and they were always there, all day playing, and we remember that, when they missed the player, they took some of us, and you'd be happy that they select you so that you can get a chance to play, because that was the only basketball court in the neighborhood.
Okay.
That's what was interesting. The only functional one was in the sports gym of our primary school.
Okay.
Can you imagine that? And all the kids were playing there, actually.
Yes.
And that's pretty much how basketball functioned and football, actually. Those were two sports that were mainstream popular in my town. That's what you could always get out of the house, and that there is always someone somewhere playing either football or basketball.
Yes,
and you can join one of these two games. And this was
for us, it would have always been football. Yeah, you could go down to the local park, and because you didn't need any facilities.
Exactly.
The expression
we played in the local park, and
the expression for England about football is we say jumpers for goalposts. So you go down there, your jumper, your trousers on, someone will take their jumper off, 2 goalposts at one end, 2 goalposts at the other end, a ball, and then you're off and you've got yourself a match. Because otherwise you needed the proper equipment or a proper court, proper facilities to play a sport, and in England you have to pay money for these things, so it often can be quite expensive to play something like tennis, for example. But football was the one thing down the local park, just set up your jumpers at either end and off you go.
No, we put the school bags for goals.
Yes, same thing.
So we play on those. That's what I haven't seen in like 2 decades. I haven't seen that in 20 years, that some kids use the school bags or whatever, improvise something like that and play football. I really haven't seen it.
And then you'd always argue if the ball hit the jumper, hit the bag, did it go in, that went in, it went out.
That wasn't as much our argument as the height of the goal was.
Yes, of course.
How high the ball went. Is it over the pole or is it inside? That was always an argument.
Or where the penalty area is and where can the goalkeeper use his hands.
Exactly. So we recognized only like the size of your legs.
Yes.
Basically, so that to be fair. Like the ball has to go in lower than 1 meter approximately, And that was that's how we grew up. But I think the tendency of our next generations is more into online football. Is like, why would I, jump in the mud and do stuff? We play football. I remember even on the snow.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
So that was also fun. But tell me, did you have growing up? Did you have this cultural diversity in your town? Did you have some? What was your perception? Actually, I started this question wrongly because I'm sure you had it. But what was your perception of the cultural diversity of London? Was there any sentiment to cultural diversity?
It's interesting because where I grew up, being right on the very edge of London, my town was actually very kind of white, British. And as I said, it was most of the families living there were people who had grown up or the parents or the grandparents had grown up in East London before London became very multicultural. And then when East London was redeveloped, those people moved out to the edges. So actually my town at that time, going back to the 90s, the early 2000s, was actually very not diverse. Most of the people that lived there were white British. There were some African or mainly West Indian migrants actually. There were some Asian migrants, but my particular town was very white. But as I said earlier, I played for a football team growing up as a kid, and we played in the East London football leagues. So we'd often have matches further into East London where it was a lot more diverse. So it was just interesting encountering diversity in that way. And then we had, of course, the commonality of football that we could share together. So football was a thing that was able to unite people of different cultures. And my team wasn't particularly diverse, being the town that I was from, but we played against teams that were much more diverse. And then if you're a kid, you just then see them as other people on a football team. And our issue with them would be they were on a rival team rather than they were of a different race or a different ethnicity and so on. And then the university that I went to was in a northern city called York. So like New York, but
York. Yeah,
and that was also, both the town and the university were also very white. But it wasn't until then I was in my early 20s and I started working as a teacher in East London, where I was working in a very diverse school with lots of white British students, white Irish students, but then African families and Caribbean families and Filipino families. And so that for me actually was where I was exposed to much more cultural diversity, was when I was working further in London. And it was brilliant, frankly, working with kids and particularly working with the families that all came from different parts of the world. But it was a Christian school, so all these families, although they were from different parts of the world, they all had Christianity in common as a shared value. And that was a really powerful thing, to be in a classroom with these kids whose parents or their grandparents might have grown up in the Philippines, or might have grown up in Nigeria, or might have grown up in Jamaica, and think about the different experiences that their grandparents or their parents might have had. But then they're there in my little classroom in East London, learning the same things and speaking the same language. I thought it was a really powerful experience.
Tell me, did you observe that they are like the Irish? Are they hanging out together, separated from, were there separation or grouping between them or on the ethnic basis, or were they just like altogether mixed in around?
My experience in the school when I was teaching as a slightly older in my 20s was that the kids were very well integrated with each other, which was really nice. Because even, of course, all the African kids were from different countries in Africa. So you'd have Nigerians and Ghanaians, and they'd all played together. And if there ever, it was only really if maybe Nigeria played Ghana in a football match, for example, that you'd notice some of the differences between them. So it was really nice growing. I think one of the great things about growing up in a diverse environment is that actually, particularly as an adult observing these kids, was they actually all played together, and they didn't really stick to their own communities because they were all in a classroom together, because they were all playing on the same school sports teams or eating the same things in the school cafeteria, that they just found they were sharing the same experiences of teachers and subjects and sports. So there was no need really for them to be separate and divided from each other.
That's an interesting question to ask, because we were always subjected to those diversities, and I'm just to those differences. Yes. And I'm just asking that from perspective: how did system respond to that? How did, in case there were such tendencies in the society that you have ethnic separations rather than integrations?
Yes.
How did system respond to that? To give a proper response,
yes.
not to have this kind of I would say issues in society. But later, when you grew up and educated yourself, you were already an adult when the conflict in Northern Ireland has ended. How did that impact the Great Britain and your relationships with Irish? Are you like, if you would sit on a table with an Irish guy and discuss politics, would you be on the same page now?
I think for the most part, I think we would be. I had one interesting experience when I was teaching, actually, and I mentioned teaching with some Irish families. And one of the characters that we teach about at school is a guy called Oliver Cromwell, who was in the 1600s, and he was the one guy that we had who wasn't from the royal family but has led the country. So we had a civil war in the 1600s, which Parliament won and defeated the king, and then so this guy Oliver Cromwell became the leader. And one thing that he had done as part of a very rich life was that he, as a military leader, had been very... he'd inflicted a lot of damage on Ireland And in England, he's kind of viewed as an interesting character who had some good ideas but then acted badly. So he's kind of a bit good and a bit bad. But in Ireland, he's just viewed as a terrible villain. And I had one parent of the kid that I was teaching, and we were talking to him about what we were teaching in school. And I said, no, we're learning about Oliver Cromwell. No, was he good or was he bad? And this guy just went to me, well, he's bad. He's evil. He did terrible things in Ireland. And that kind of startled me slightly because this was a guy back in the 1600s, and I wasn't expecting someone from 300, 400 years ago to still provoke such a strong reaction in someone. Because for me, I mentioned earlier, growing up was generally quite safe, and so I was very privileged to be able to view history as something interesting, but not necessarily something that would stir really strong emotions in me. So that was very interesting to see that. But for the most part, my experience growing up was that there could be some problems in London sometimes, and my mum was often a bit nervous if I went to London on the train. She'd always say, just be careful, find the phone box. In those days, no mobile phones, but find the phone box and give me a call just so I know you're safe. But I was about 14, 15 by the time the peace process had happened. And I was very lucky that as a child we had 2 holidays to Ireland. And on one of those holidays we found ourselves sitting in a cafe that was overlooking the town square in one particular town where there had been a big terrorist attack a few years earlier. And that particular attack was when I was very small, so I wasn't really aware of it. But my mum kept saying, I can't believe we were in this town where that attack happened. It was in the news, but it feels so normal. And so for English people being in this town, you might have expected that there'd be some difficulty and the Irish people might be a bit nervous being around English people or just not like them very much. But what we found actually was that the normal people who worked in the cafes or who worked in the shops that we went to on holiday were fine. We're just very welcoming, very accommodating, and you wouldn't know, and certainly with me as a kid, I didn't pick up at all that there was any nervousness or any suspicion or that we were somewhere. There was actually quite a difficult history between my people and the people that live there. And I think that's something that I find very interesting now as well, is that my experience is that most normal people want to get on and are interested in different people and want to live a normal, peaceful life. And so my experience mostly talking with Irish people either in Ireland or in England is that we do what we did we talk about sport or we talk about music, we talk about normal stuff, and for most people that kind of political stuff doesn't really impact on how you treat a normal person in everyday life.
Yeah, but do you think now, from this perspective, from this moment in time, do you think that the conflict in Northern Ireland can be sparked again?
I think it can, and that's one of the things that worries me in the news at the moment with one of the issues of Britain leaving the European Union is that Northern Ireland is part of Britain and has left the European Union, but Southern Ireland is
still in the
a separate country and is still in the European Union. And one of the things about the peace deal that I spoke about in the late 1990s was that border between Northern Ireland, which is Britain, and Southern Ireland, which is not Britain, is completely open.
Non-existent, actually.
Non-existent. And one of the holidays that I had as a kid actually was on a boat. We had a boat on a canal, on a river going through Ireland, and at one point that river is the border. So we were just on this river on a boat, and one side is Britain, Northern Ireland, and the other side is Southern Ireland. And there was nothing. There's no checkpoint, no police, no soldiers. There's nothing there at all. And so one of the problems now, though, is that where Great Britain has left the European Union, is that there kind of now has to be a border because there's different...
It's a formal governmental border, administrative border. Right?
Exactly, yeah. And so that's been in the news very much over the last month or so, is the Prime Minister...
Are you illegally? It's like every day breaking the border, walking up and down the street.
Just last week, actually, our latest Prime Minister, one of many we've had over the last few years, has just signed a new peace agreement with the European Union, or a new trade agreement with the European Union to try to resolve some of these issues. Because if you have a border between Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland, that's the type of thing that could spark problems, because you might have people who live in the north of Ireland but feel more Irish, or you might have people who live in the south of Ireland but feel more British, and that's not a problem now, but it could become a problem if you have to have an actual border there. So that is one of the difficult issues that Britain is facing currently with leaving the European Union.
But you see, that's what comes to our mind immediately. I would say, at least it does with me. It comes to mind. It's ridiculous to build new borders. In 21st century. More you look at it, it becomes more ridiculous that, instead of being more open and be more, able to travel, see places, see diversities, we are again bunking up within borders.
And this is definitely happening in Britain. And obviously we've left the European Union, and our current government, not to get too political, but I would say our current government are not doing the best job. But one of the things that they're doing to try to increase their popularity is to start blaming foreigners and immigrants for some of the problems that I would say are actually caused by their policies. And it's often very easy for politicians to blame other people, isn't it? To blame the lowest in society for problems that are actually caused by people at the top. But it's interesting you talk about borders. My family were on holiday in Saloon, Montenegro last weekend, and as we approached the border here, there was just this dog just walking across the border with no... I thought what a strange world we have, where a dog can just walk across the border, no problem, the dog's life is the same. But imagine... we have to stop and talk to a policeman, and the policeman's very nice, but we still have to talk to a policeman. He asks us questions and he looks at our documents, and why is it harder for a human being to move around than it is for this dog to move around?
But it's like, imagine another interesting thing about it is that if the dog was in your car, you'd need some documents for it.
Yes.
Can you imagine? Yeah. And if the dog is just, free to wander around, then it can...
Because, we have a dog actually that we took from the dog shelter just down the road. So we adopted him from the dog shelter. And when we had our first child, we went back to the UK to have the baby, and we thought, we're going to be away for 3 or 4 months. We don't want to leave the dog here. We're going to bring the dog back with us. And we discovered that you can't fly a dog into the United Kingdom.
No, it's an animal.
You can fly a dog out of the United Kingdom, and you can take a dog into the United Kingdom by road or by boat, but you can't fly a dog into the United Kingdom. I have no idea why. So I had to travel.
Nobody knows about the flying dog. I mean, come on. Nobody thought about the flying dog in the state admin.
So no one in Britain thought about it anyway. So I had to travel separately from my heavily pregnant wife. So me and the dog flew from Pristina to Brussels, because that was fine. I could fly the dog to Brussels. We took the train from Brussels to Rotterdam. I then had to walk with the dog and my bag through Rotterdam to get to another train station to go to the port in Rotterdam, and then take an overnight boat from Holland to the United Kingdom.
You smuggled the dog in? It was the sailing dog. You can sail in the dog.
Exactly, it's crazy. So all of that, as you said,
you can baptize him now into the sailor. It's like a sailor.
So it was actually difficult to take that dog across borders, but no, otherwise, we're watching this dog in Montenegro just walking across the border, and easy for him. But as you say, the crazy thing would have been, had he been in my car, it would have been completely different.
Yeah, I mean, it shows a bit the ridiculousness of the borders.
Exactly.
I would say that was funny to me about the EU investment here in our conflict. I would say I would call it exactly that. EU investment in our conflict. They built a very fancy border point checkpoint in Merdare.
Okay.
A very fancy, huge one. Like it costed God knows how much.
Yes.
But at the same time, they are investing in a highway that will connect Kosovo with Serbia and, connect further
Yes.
around. So I'm like wondering why. Really, what's the point? I mean, instead of smoothing it, making it easier, faster to communicate and travel, and you're just making another obstruction point where people are they're waiting to get in and out of Kosovo sometimes for like 6-8 hours, God knows, so for what?
Exactly.
That's further with the borders that we have around in the region that time. We are more I guess living here and being born here. We are more acquainted with the borders. That's what I've been since I was born. I got more and more borders around me.
Yes,
more and more borders to cross. Imagine to go from here to Thessaloniki, I have to pass.
Exactly, and that's one of the things growing up in Britain, of course, where it's basically an island. So the only border is either at a ferry port or in an airport. And otherwise, we can drive from London to Manchester, even to Scotland or to Wales, and it's very, very straightforward for us to travel around. And I guess foreign holidays would be something else that I took for granted. That I didn't have too many foreign holidays as a kid. Mainly to Ireland was one that we had. But certainly as I grew up into my 20s and I started to travel independently from my family, and there were more and more cheap airlines springing up, Ryanair and EasyJet and Wizz Air, that we could fly and travel very easily. From London, we've got 5 or 6 airports in London, and we could be
I've been on 2.
pretty much anywhere in Europe within 3 or 4 hours or less. Was a real privilege that we found growing up, and it's again something that might get harder with Britain leaving the European Union, but something in my 20s I perhaps took a bit for granted, but also I was able to take advantage of that and have experience travelling in Spain and into North Africa and different parts of Europe as well. I mentioned borders because we are living in this. When you look at it, like from a side, not really politically or ethically involved or engaged. When you look at it objectively, as British, just look at it. Our all common agenda is to go into EU. Yes, yeah.
Both Kosovo, I would say Serbia, Macedonia, Albania, whatever.
Exactly, yeah.
We all want to get into EU.
Whereas we're leaving.
While we are investing in further division among ourselves.
Yes.
Even micro divisions from micro level to, and that's why I ran this conversation with your divisions and your issues, because I wanted people to see here that actually it gets us nowhere.
Yes, exactly, yeah.
We need to think about overcoming it. If you could overcome it, we need to overcome it. We need to be more what's the word in English? More resilient.
It could be resilient.
Resilient. We are less resilient, is what I wanted to say. We all had conflicts. You had conflicts.
Yeah.
We had conflicts in between ourselves, but you could overcome it. We did not yet.
Although, of course, as I've been saying, the fear for us is that we might overcome it, if that's a word. And we might be, having overcome it in the late 90s and had a relatively peaceful period of 20 years or so, we might now be going backwards and making more problems for ourselves.
Exactly. More borders.
Exactly. More borders make more problems.
More borders make more problems. That was for me funny when one of the astronauts, I'm not sure which one, said this. Like after we departed for the space station, and then the first time I looked from the space station at the Earth, and the space station was circling around maybe Asia or whatever, and it was nice weather, so he could see the Earth clearly, and he was like, at that moment I saw how pointless the borders are, because actually they don't exist. You know, when you look at them from space, that's what I'm saying. When you look at them objectively from, you know, outside, they're pointless.
Yes.
I mean, the entire,
And
charade about it is.
And the opposite perspective is true also. We know a guy who runs the Pristina Observatory, and he has an NGO to do with astronomy.
We'll observe that because we heard about it already,
Okay.
and that's an interesting thing. We were thinking about taking kids over there. I don't know if they have the telescope function.
I think they do now, yeah. And his big thing, because he also is involved in kind of interethnic dialogue, and his big thing is that as we look up at the stars, it's the same sky for everyone. And I think one of his organisations is called, I think, Under One Sky, because as you look up at the stars, it's the same moon, it's the same stars.
Exactly.
Whatever country you're from, whatever borders you have, there's no borders in space. So not only from space looking down do you see no borders, but from Earth looking up, you don't see any borders either.
Exactly. Very, very nice point. Tell me, growing up, how did you look at us before you came here? You came here first time when? In Balkans?
In 2017 we moved here, so I was 32 at that stage.
Before you came here, what did you expect? What was your perception? I want before and after, but I want first to explore on before.
That's a good question. My experience of talking to people that we live here is that people in the UK will still associate this part of the world with the conflicts of the 90s, and when we say where we live, people will say, oh, is it safe? You know, you had wars there in the 1990s. And I wasn't expecting it to be like that, because obviously, mercifully, in terms of warfare, that has, is it fair to say it's certainly not like the 1990s anymore. And so I wasn't expecting it to be particularly dangerous. I wasn't expecting here to be as beautiful as it is. I think people in the UK aren't aware too much, in general, of the culture and the beauty that there is in this part of the world. So I've been struck by that. I don't know what I was expecting. I think that's such a good question, which I should have a better answer for, and I'm sorry. I think probably I came here with an open mind. I think that's probably more what it was. That we weren't necessarily even expecting to move here. When we first thought about moving abroad, we thought, no, we're teachers, we'd like to move somewhere to help, and my wife had previously been in Uganda, and we thought maybe we might move there. And we weren't really expecting to move to this part of the world, but it was suggested to us that this could be somewhere we could come and work, and it felt right to us to come here. But we only decided to move here about 6 months or so before we actually did come here. So we didn't have too much time really to build up any preconceptions about what we might expect. I think we moved with an open mind and ready to come and learn from people, and to learn by being here rather than having certain expectations, I think.
I wanted to ask you a bit about Her Majesty the Queen. She passed away recently.
Yes.
She was quite historic figure even during her long life. She was long time queen.
Absolutely.
And she was very remarkable. But I think that she was a role model queen, I would say. I don't know if we will ever in the world heritage ever have a queen like her again.
No, I don't think so. A very good queen for the modern age, because she was very good at not offending people, basically by not saying anything, which is very against the culture now, where people always want to have their say and put their view, and Twitter, of course, is all about everyone putting their views out there for the public. And the Queen was very, very good at just not saying anything particularly interesting, and therefore not saying anything very offensive. But what she did do is she was such a hard worker at travelling around Britain and around the rest of the world, and visiting schools and visiting people's workplaces and visiting cultural sites and meeting people and interacting with people. whilst not saying anything very much at all. And that's so countercultural, and I think people really respect it actually, that she kept herself very private whilst being such a public figure and doing her public work, keeping her private thoughts largely to herself, which people just don't do anymore.
But on the other hand, she wasn't remembered as somebody who, you know, she was just, you know, very, very queenish,
Exactly,
you know,
very, very
not
elegant.
going out of the box in any moment, like not overstepping herself, even if she had like challenging, I would say, situations throughout her mandate, if that's what we call it.
So. I mean, she had such a long reign. I mean, she came to power not long after the Second World War ended. And then she was the queen all the way through the 60s and the 70s and on into...
all the crisis periods.
It's a long time from the 1950s to 2023, as I don't know, forgetting which year it is. And, yeah, I mean, that's a long lifetime. There are plenty of people who have been born and passed on during her reign, and the queen is all they knew. And so now we have to get used to a new national anthem. Our national anthem was
To the
God
King.
Save the Queen.
God
Now we
Save
have to
the
sing
King.
God Save the King. And you watch our sports teams now struggling with that, make sure they get the right word. And we'll have our money will start coming out with the King's head on it, of course. So it'll be, it's just interesting little changes. I think
She will go off the £50.
eventually, yes. Obviously, there'll be lots of them still in circulation, but as the new ones get made, they'll be made with the King's head on it rather than the Queen's.
Really?
Yeah, and it's all for most of us. I mean, I'm nearly 40 now, and all I've ever known is a queen. So now
It's
I have to have a king.
it's all your life. She was there.
And more than I've lost count of the number of prime ministers. I think she's had 15 or so prime ministers.
That's impressive.
Even the last thing she did, 2 days before she died, she welcomed into office a new prime minister. And then, so she was still working 2 days before she died, inducting a new prime minister. And then that prime minister only lasted 6 weeks. And you think the Queen managed to be the Queen for 60 years, and then we had a prime minister for just 6 weeks. And it's amazing how she managed to stay so active and so professional, I guess, for such a long time.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, she was keeping the kingdom together, I would say.
Yeah.
You know, and she was such a figure that she could show up everywhere, and she would raise the same impression. Like she could control things. Do you think that King Charles will be able to do the same?
Well, I think you'll find it very difficult. I think the Queen was such a respectable figure that I think people who don't even like the idea of a royal family, don't like the idea of hereditary power, think it's very old-fashioned. Most people who feel like that still looked at the Queen as a person and thought, well, she's a nice person, she works hard, she does a good job, even if they don't like the role, the status that she has. And I think Prince Charles will find that very difficult to replicate. I mean, the poor man has been waiting for most of his life to become king. I think he's well into his 70s now. He's a pretty old
I was
guy.
wondering always if he's going to make it.
Exactly, yeah.
Touchdown in the last moment, I would say.
And he's viewed as where people respect the Queen and view her as very, very elegant. Prince Charles is a bit more a figure of fun. He's got these big ears, and that's kind of what he's known for a bit. He speaks his mind a bit more politically. Although, to be fair to him, he was one of the very first people back in the 80s and the 90s who was talking about protecting the environment and protecting against climate change. And he was probably right about that, but in the 90s, he didn't want to hear about that sort of stuff. And today, of course, some people still don't want to hear about that, and so think he's been a bit too political, and which is something the Queen never did do. So I think he'll find it very difficult. And the people who don't like having a royal family but did like the Queen, I think King Charles isn't going to command the same respect that I think the Queen did as a person.
But I think, you know what I find interesting? Princess Kate Middleton, I think she quite picked up from Queen Elizabeth this behavior and style and modesty. I would, at least it looks like that to me from perspective of a foreigner observing it.
I think so. And what's interesting about her is that she came from a relatively normal background.
Yeah, but she's very queenish, I would say. Very elegant, very...
I think she's done a very good job of... I think you're right that she dresses very sensibly, very respectably, and again doesn't express many opinions. And you compare that with Prince Harry and Meghan,
they're more,
who are much more, obviously very much more speaking their mind. And some people think, well, that's fair enough. Of course, they're ordinary people who have, well, they're human beings who have feelings, and of course they should be able to share them. Whereas there's a lot of other people who think, no, they should, no, they're rich, they should just shut up about it and stop complaining. And so because they speak out a lot more, they're a lot more controversial. Whereas I think you're right that Kate Middleton doesn't say anything very much, but she does the hard work of all the public appearances. And I don't think people actively like her as much as they like the Queen, but I don't think many people dislike her either, because she's not really said anything.
On the other hand, the Queen had a long period to make herself likable. Yes, she was in reign for forever.
Exactly,
and let's give Kate a chance. Actually, let's the life is
ahead. I think the older the Queen got, I think more and more people viewed her as like a nice old granny who's grandmother who's always been there, and whereas Prime Ministers come and go, particularly over the last few years we've had loads of Prime Ministers. The Queen was someone who'd always been there and kind of represented an old-fashioned kind of solid Britishness, where people were a bit more private and people worked hard. She kind of represented that era. As we've moved into a different era where life is a bit different, life is quicker, life is faster, opinions change very, very quickly, whereas I think the Queen represented a stability, which, as you said, you only get that if you've been around for so long, this kind of nice old grandmother kind of figure.
The reputation.
Exactly. Everyone loves their grandmother, don't they?
Exactly,
the Queen was like a grandmother for the British people.
Yeah. And when you look at it historically in Europe, history major, I find at least resemblance with Prince Harry and his former king, late uncle, what was his name? Queen Elizabeth's uncle. That was the king. He was also a playboy, I would say. King George. Yes. Thank you. He was also, him and his wife were also having the similar life story when they wanted to actually rather have the parting life than actually have the obligation or the weight of the reign, I would say.
Although they had circumstances kind of forced upon them because they were the king and queen during the Second World War and during the bombing of London and so on. So they did a very good job of, I think they stayed in London during the Second World War, and so the Queen as she was at the time, or the Queen Mother as I knew her when she was much older, they got a lot of respect for staying in London, and they went out to visit where the slums of East London, where many poor people had their houses destroyed. They went out there to visit people and to talk to them, and so they're very much remembered as being the brave wartime king and queen. Is how their reputation has emerged into the future.
Because looking through the history, they appeared to me as more. They decided to live the same life like Harry and.
But you could hide it more in those days, couldn't you? That's the problem. You can't. There's so much more media, and even before kind of the internet and Twitter and so on, Prince Harry was. Well, I guess William and Harry with Princess Diana, they grew up with the newspaper spotlight on them the whole time. Princess Diana was this very
she was very loved
character, very, very loved by a lot of people. Other people viewed her with a bit of suspicion, but I think because she was quite young and glamorous, she always had the newspapers on her, and therefore William and Harry always grew up with the newspapers on them as well. So everything they did as kids.
It's not a simple life, actually. When you look at, there is paparazzi popping around everywhere. You have security. You have all the time people, media flash on you.
And this is Prince Harry's point now over the last few years. It's just he's kind of got fed up with all that. He's saying it's actually been really difficult to grow up, whereas William and Catherine are not saying that type of stuff. They're not really saying anything publicly. Harry is now kind of saying, "No, I've had enough," basically. Although interestingly, he says he's had enough of the media spotlight, but I feel like over the last year they've been more in the media than ever. They're doing all these Oprah Winfrey interviews and Netflix documentaries and so on.
There is a book published as well.
And a book published. So I'm very sympathetic with him saying that actually, even though I was a prince and I had lots of privileges growing up, it was actually very difficult in lots of other ways. But if he is fed up with the media spotlight, I don't quite understand why he is now choosing to do the books and the interviews and remain in the media spotlight when he says that's what he's grown tired of and found difficult for his whole life.
Do you think that he would be able to earn a decent living as a Harry from a neighborhood somewhere?
I mean, I think that's the problem. I think that's probably one of his problems is he'll never be just an ordinary Harry, really. He would always...
I cannot imagine him flipping burgers at McDonald's, like, without some royal intervention.
Exactly. Although interestingly, I mean, I've always felt a certain relationship with Prince Harry. We're almost exactly the same age, so we went through the same kind of life milestones at the same time, and it was because he was someone a bit less royal. Again, he got in a bit of trouble for doing silly things when he was younger, and you can kind of think, oh yeah, he's perhaps a bit more of a relatable royal figure almost. When he was younger, I could have imagined him being someone my age, flipping burgers. But he's of course now making really good points. Of course I can't do that, I will always have the security and everyone around me, and I can't live a normal life. Whereas when he was younger, he was someone that, because I saw some similarities being the same age, I could have imagined him being a bit more normal.
Yeah, that would be funny, really, to see him a bit more. I would love to see him doing something.
Interestingly, actually, Meghan Markle's final royal appearance was she visited a school which was right next to the school that I used to work at, and actually I had worked in this particular school only for about 4 months. But yeah, her last royal appearance was visiting a school in the town where I used to teach. So it's really interesting, seeing her interacting with the type of kids that I used to teach and used to work with all the time. And yeah, they could have had a good role in the royal family, I think, as being a bit more relatable, a bit more laid back, a bit more modern. But that hasn't happened for all sorts of complicated reasons, and some reasons that they would think were difficult.
Man, I introduced you earlier with George. This is George. This is Jole. He's Serbian, but this is in English we can call him George. George is our mockingbird. We can say Jivjan bird. Bravo. I'm impressed that you even remember the exact pronunciation. He has a question usually for our guest. He has a question for you, so please lift him and take the question.
Okay.
You have to read it.
In Serbian? Is he a Serbian?
It's in English. Okay. He is a multilingual.
What if your kid married a local? I'd be very surprised because they're very young. They're 3 and 1. So
let's imagine they're not.
Imagine they're older. I would have no problem with that at all. When my wife and I first moved here, we didn't have kids. We were thinking we would live here for 2 years and then go back to the UK and settle back into jobs there and raise a family. And actually what we found was that we love it here, and we love the people, we love this community, we love the natural environment, the mountains and so on all around here. And so the reason that we've stayed now into our 6th year and looking to stay longer into the future is simply because we really love it here and we love the people here. And so if our kid was older, I would be very happy for him to marry a local. If they wanted then to go and live in the UK, I'd be happy with that. If they wanted to stay here and live, I'd be very happy because we think life here is good. So.
Wouldn't you be concerned if they would live here?
How can I be concerned? I've chosen to live here. So how could I be concerned about my kid choosing to live here? And there's a lot of good stuff here. Family is actually one of the things that I love most about here. And I say this as someone obviously who's moved away from his parents who are still living in London. But I love how families here stick together, and you have kids and parents and grandparents living in the same house or very close to each other. And there seems to be a real priority on family life here, which I think is such an important thing and something which we've moved away from in the UK. So yeah, if my kid wanted to stay here and wanted to live as a family in this place, I would think that would be a good thing. And you talked about how when you were a kid you would go out and you knew someone somewhere would be playing sport. But for me, we had to call each other up on the phone and arrange to meet somewhere, because there isn't the same culture in England of just being out on the streets. And it really struck me here that families, different families live very close together in this neighbourhood, and people have their front doors open, and the kids are all out in the street playing with each other. And people in England say, 50 years ago you could leave your front door open and the kids play together, but you can't do that now. And so in that sense, family life here and life for kids here is what people in the UK wish it was like. Much more playing going on, much more people mixing together in the community. And there's people who live in London who don't even know their next door neighbours. And that's not what life is like here at all. So yeah, if my kid married local, I would be very happy with that. And we love people here, we love this community. And if he wanted to stay living in this community, that would be a great thing.
That's a nice message to to our fellow citizens, because I think that's
so.
one of the greatest stereotypes we have about each other are interethnic marriages. Although interethnic marriages that we know here have generated very interesting and prominent figures. But our stereotypes are still still at the highest bloom. For the end, please tell us the message. Tell us, how do you see us in 5 or 10 years? Where do you see us, and what would be your message to Serbs and Albanians and other communities living in Kosovo? How to overcome what we have right now? What to strive to? What is your message? Where do you see us?
For me, in my experience, and I know my experience is not the same as other people's, I think the key lies in personal relationships. And I spoke about how when I was teaching in England, we had kids from all different parts of the world, but they were in school together and they had a lot of things in common. They supported the same sports teams. So a kid from Nigeria and a kid from Ireland and a kid from the Philippines and a kid from Britain could all support West Ham, as it was where we are, or Manchester United. And so the key therefore is, I think, having personal relationships. And what I've experienced here from the different communities is lots and lots of really, really lovely people, and we've been made to feel so welcome here by Serbs, by Albanians, by Roma families that we know. People are so welcoming and so loving of us, and that's one of the reasons we've loved living here. One of the reasons we've stayed so long is that we've felt really, really loved. And so I would love it for the people of the different communities here to also be able to come into loving relationships with each other and to be able to see each other as neighbours. And I know that can be very difficult for people. A lot of things have happened here. People have had a lot of difficult experiences. And so for me, it's about being able to meet people, to interact with people, and to begin to be able to see each other as a human being. So I see you as Victor, and I see you as the father of a wonderful child that I teach, and that for me is what your identity is, not in whatever nationality you are. And so I would love to see people having personal relationships with each other, building friendships with each other, and being able to learn together and play together and to laugh together and to share the ordinary things of life together is what I think is the hope for this place. Because all the people here that I've met have been so loving and so welcoming, and I'd love to see people sharing that with each other.
Matthew, thank you very much. I hope that our message and our plea to the people to be more open to diversities, to be more open to meeting each other, learning about each other, and that's what we did today with Matt. We learned about each other, we exchanged, we spoke about each other, and let's all try to do it together. Let's try to learn about the other community. Let's try to respect each other more, and trust me, there is always something to learn, something new and interesting and exciting, and let's leave our past behind. Let's try to, we don't need to forget it. We just need to go over it, I would say. It stays there, we need to be aware of it, but then we need to go look further into our future, not be hostages of our past. So thank you, Matthew. Thank you all for watching us. Follow us on our pages, so I'll tell this in Serbian as well. Zapratite nas na našim stranicama, subscribe-ite se na YouTube i Facebook i Instagram ako to već niste. Hvala vam puno i vidimo se u sledećoj emisiji.